Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the organizers of this conference. I am really grateful to be here. It's actually my first time ever in Ohio. Even though I grew up in Pennsylvania, so it's a bit strange, it's my first time. But I've been receiving such a warm welcome, and this group of people has been no exception. My name is Alexandria Lafci, as introduced, and I am one of the founders of an organization called New Story. What we do is build communities of homes around the world for people who are living in some of the most dangerous conditions globally. But I want to start with just two snapshots from my life. And the first one starts a very, very long time ago. So I was 4 years old, and I was living with my grandparents in Turkey. Now, I'm half Turkish, and I'm half black, I'm half African American, and so I was this biracial tan kid walking around Turkey, and there was no one like me. So my grandparents loved to walk me around and show me off, and people would gawk and stare and ask questions, and I think that one of the reasons why was because of my curly hair, but another reason was because my grandparents loved to dress me like I was 30 years old. I don't know where they got this blazer. So I have this blazer on, I'm walking around, I'm exposed to the culture in Turkey. And I did want to start our morning off with a laugh, but I also wanted to share this because from a very, very young age, I was exposed to two starkly different cultures. So when I came back to live with my mom in the US, I was still very, very curious about the world around me. I wanted to see more, I wanted to travel, I wanted to experience more cultures. But my mother was a single mom at the time, and we lived in a very low-income household. And so getting on a plane was out of the question. But my mom, being the very resourceful woman that she was, found a way for us to see the world without ever leaving our living room. So most Friday nights, for years, we would go to the local public library, and we would get some of these. And because this is a college campus, I think for many of you, this looks like something out of a museum. It's fairly archaic, but for a long time, this is how we watched things. This was before Hulu, and this was before Netflix. My favorite thing to do was to sit on the couch with my mother and VHS and chill. And with these tapes, we would go to the Great Wall of China, we'd explore the Sahara Desert, we would see the sleepiest beach towns in all corners of the globe. And, of course, I was mesmerized by the natural beauty and by the architectural wonders, the food that I felt like I could smell through the screen. But the thing that I was most struck by was the fact that almost anywhere that we traveled, there was massive amounts of inequity. And I felt like I wanted to do something about it. I needed to do something about it. So fast forward to high school, and I'm pretty good at science, so I think combining impact with my desire to see the world and my talent in the sciences meant my perfect dream career in Doctors Without Borders. So I was obsessed with this. I was going to be a Doctors Without Borders physician. That was my plan. I talked about it all the time. But I soon came to the realization that, okay, I had to finish high school, then I had undergrad, then I had to go to medical school, an internship and residency, and it was going to be a very, very long time before I could ever get my hands dirty. And I didn't want to wait, so I started doing some internet research, and I found a program that would allow me to volunteer in the summer in Peru at a medical clinic. So I was really excited by this prospect, and I went and I pitched my mother. And she said, absolutely, honey, as long as you can get the money, you can go. So in my mind, that was a green light. What I would later learn from her was that that was a very supportive, absolutely not, because she did not think that I was, at 15 years old, going to get thousands of dollars in a matter of a few weeks to go on this trip. But I was full steam ahead, so I thought, how could I raise this money? And I sat down and I started writing some handwritten letters. I wrote about a dozen of them. And then I walked to the nicest area in my town, and I found the biggest, most beautiful houses that I could find, and I stuffed mailboxes. And then I waited. And there's no reason that I should have believed that anything was going to happen from that, right? I was basically spamming people. But a few weeks later, a woman gives me a call, and she says that she was inspired by what I had written. She wanted to support this goal of mine, and she ended up funding the entire thing. She ended up being a mentor and friend as well, but she funded it, and now I'm on the plane, I'm headed to Peru. And my first day on a Monday, it's, fairly simple. I am taking temperatures, I'm taking blood pressure, I'm learning how to do the intake triage forms. And by Wednesday, things got a little bit more intense, and I was cleaning babies that had been born just seconds before. Reminder, I'm like 15 years old. And then towards the end of the week, there's a more serious case. There was a woman who was working on a remote farm, and a dog had bitten a massive chunk out of her leg, out of her calf. And because she was very poor and because she was working in a remote area, she hadn't come to the clinic for a couple of days, and the doctors were pretty certain that she had gotten an infection, and my job was to clean the wound before the doctors came in and addressed it. So I take a deep breath and I walk up to her and I lift off kind of the blanket or gauze or whatever it was that was on her leg, and I look down at this gaping wound that was filled with a pool of maggots. And that ended my career with Doctors Without Borders. So I'm not a quitter. I stayed in that program and I ended up doing some volunteer work in orphanages and in schools. And a couple of weeks later, I was back on a plane to Pennsylvania. And I was reflecting on the trip. And while I was grateful for the opportunity, I was also pretty frustrated because on the plane with me, there were about a dozen other volunteers. And I knew that if another plane wasn't headed in the opposite direction filled with volunteers, that many of the programs that we had volunteered with, the orphanages, the schools, the clinics, that had become dependent on volunteers, they might have to close their doors. And my 15-year-old self didn't have a name for it at the time, but that didn't feel very sustainable, did it? More specifically, I was wondering, why were we not empowering the local individuals and local organizations with the tools and the skills to solve their own problems? Which leads me to story number 2. As one of the founders of New Story, I am able to shape the way the organization is run. And in our building of homes and in our building of communities and doing the community building that we do, one of the things I'm the most proud of is the fact that we find and use local organizations and local people who are uniquely positioned to navigate in these countries to partner with. And that's one of the reasons why we've been able to be so successful as a very young organization. So I want to spend the next 2 minutes allowing Ruben, who's our program manager in Haiti, to give you a bit more of a visual through video of the work that we do. He's going to highlight one of the many communities that we've been able to build over the past few years.
It's hard to describe it, what a home means. It's having one life's most basic human needs. The security of knowing your children are safe. A home is also the small things. It's family having a place to come together and laugh. It's kids running around playing with their friends. It's a peaceful night's sleep. For the family of Labadrie, this kind of homes hasn't always been part of their story. I grew up near here. I understand the hardship of living without a home. No clean water, no proper sanitation. When it rained, water would leak through and soak everything. How can any kid reach their full potential when they are worried about their safety more than their future? This is why I do this work. I know firsthand having a home and community transforms lives. A home that is safe and secure, one that is truly your own, it gives families the foundation to thrive. To focus on what the future holds, a place you want to invest in, a place you can be proud of. 154 families now live in Labadrie. Each home was built by locals with local materials. This home by no means solves all the problems, but it gives families the foundation to change their story.
Living in survival mode ends today, and that is the power of these new homes.
So Ruben does a much better job than I could do. And like I said, he just highlighted one of our communities, but in the past 3 years, we've been able to fund over 1,500 homes. We have impacted the lives of over 5,000 people. And we've also been able to do a few other fun things along the way. We've rang the NASDAQ opening bell. We got accepted into the most prestigious startup accelerator in the world, Y Combinator. We have gotten incredible press and very strategic partnerships, and we've grown our amazing team. But the thing that I'm more proud of than these numbers is the fact that we have found a way to build disaster-resilient homes for only around $6,000. As this picture illustrates, we include the beneficiaries, the future home recipients, in the process of designing their homes and their communities. We collect impact data to show us if what we are doing is working, and if not, we make pivots. As a nonprofit, we even invest in R&D for home innovations and technology to push the social housing sector forward. And we've been able to navigate in some countries that organizations many times are senior, where they've failed to do some of the same work that we're doing. And I say all this very much not to brag, but to show what has happened in just 3 years' time, because if 3 years ago, you had asked me to do even a fraction of these things, I would have been paralyzed by fear. I do not have a construction background. I'm not an architect. Coming from a very low-income background, raising millions of dollars just felt like a Herculean task. And again, organizations that I admired had failed to do work in some of the places where News Story has now succeeded. So how did this happen? Well, during college and after college, I worked pretty much exclusively in nonprofit organizations. And while I had some good experiences, I was left largely jaded. And so I decided to do a stint in the for-profit sector. I got a job as a supply chain logistics manager, which is just as boring as it sounds. And I was also living in Atlanta, a new city where I didn't know anyone. So hating my job plus not knowing anyone, and I was just not living my best life at that time. But I decided I needed to stick with the job for about a year. And so after, transparently a few weeks of kind of moping and just hating life, I decided that I needed to find my tribe. And so I went to every social entrepreneurship gathering, meetup, hackathon that I could find. And then eventually I met these guys, who are strangers turned brothers and who are my co-founders in this work. The first time that we met, we talked about the fact that in 2010, that massive earthquake struck Haiti, and how almost 5 years later, people were still living in the exact same thin tarp tents that they were given immediately after that earthquake. That's still the case today, by the way. We talked about this issue, how surprised we were, and the fact that we wanted to do something about it, but we were all 24 years old, and this was a very complex and a very expensive issue to try to solve. So we first did two things. Number one is it's important not to reinvent the wheel. So we did a lot of research into organizations that were already tackling this problem. We thought that if we found an organization that we liked, that we would put all of our efforts towards supporting that cause. Unfortunately, what we found was that there was a massive lack of transparency and accountability, and sometimes a lack of quality in some of the existing organizations and existing solutions. So we thought, in addition to solving this housing issue, we might need to rethink a little bit how the nonprofit, how the social impact space operates. So the next thing that we did was to see, could we get support? Again, we were 24 years old, we didn't have a tremendous amount of experience, and the Haiti issue in particular was a very sensitive one, because over $1 billion was given after that earthquake, and a lot of philanthropists had already been scorned. There was a lot of scandal surrounding that particular area. So would people trust us enough to give us money? And would people still care about or want to give their money to this particular issue? So what we did to test that out was create a crowdfunding site. We didn't put much resources or time into it. We hacked something together, but we wanted to test out a few things. First, we did a 100% model where every single donation went directly to home building costs, materials and labor. That's still our model, and we fundraise separately for our operational overhead. The second was to create a personal connection. So you can see through this snapshot that people got to meet the family, see their photo, engage with their story. And then we followed through for full accountability with a video of the exact family that a person funded, whether they had given $5 or $5,000. We launched this around Christmas time, and we asked just our friends and family to ask people for donations to News Story families instead of Christmas presents. And our goal that holiday season was to raise funds for about one home, so $6,000. And when we got the funds for that first home, the feeling was like more exhilarating than skydiving. But then one home turned into 3, into 5, into 7. This model was something that people were really trusting and believing in. So around March, we went to Haiti and we watched the first batch of home move-ins. And I can still remember each and every face, each and every expression of families when they moved from those tents, those slums that were filled with cholera outbreaks and prostitution rings and crime, into this new safe community where they owned both the homes and the land that the homes sit on. Now that we've crossed the 1,000 home, the 1,000 family threshold, it's very difficult it's increasingly difficult for me to remember each and every face, but here are a few of my favorites. That still makes me smile a lot. There are two themes in these stories from my life that I'd like to leave with you today as you go through this conference and as you either embark upon or continue upon your journey as someone who is going to make social change. And the first one is that a lack of experience should not be an excuse for a lack of action. So in my life, I was tasked with raising more money as a 15-year-old than my mother was spending on 6 months of her mortgage. I had never raised money. I didn't know how to raise that money, but I knew something that I was good at, which was writing and telling my own story, and I gave it a try, and that allowed me to go to Peru. Now, that writing exercise, the stuffing of mailboxes, that could have totally failed, but a guaranteed failure would have been to do nothing. The second is us starting News Story. As 4 24-year-olds, we lacked a lot of the experience, but if we had let that inexperience lead to inaction, then News Story as it exists today would not be here. Now, I'm not saying to have inexperience and go foolishly toward pursuing any idea, right? If you are passionate about something, then invest the time into doing the research and in acquiring the knowledge to be more informed. And then get the network around you. Get mentors and get peers, people who will complement your weaknesses and help you to pursue your idea in a more informed and strategic way. So at News Story, like I mentioned, I don't have construction or architecture experience, but I have this tribe of mentors, people who are professionals in those industries, people who have experience growing nonprofits and leading teams, and those people advise me each and every day. And eventually I do start to learn a lot of the things that I didn't know before, and I'm not going to become an expert in everything, so in other areas I delegate. The next thing that I'd like to leave with you is the idea of a minimum viable test, and this has been one of probably one of my most strategic learnings as an entrepreneur, as a social entrepreneur. And this very simply means find the smallest possible version of your idea, something that's not going to take too much time, that's not going to take too many resources, but that can show you if your idea is worth pursuing or if it's time to switch to a different direction. So with the example of me wanting to be a Doctors Without Borders physician, I felt absolutely sure about that at the time. But I did a small test. I went to Peru, I volunteered in a clinic, I realized that I did not have the stomach for it, so instead of putting all of those years and all of those hundreds of thousands of dollars towards becoming a physician, I instead was powered with the knowledge to make a pivot and to do something else. On a smaller scale, when I was in Atlanta and hating my job and hating my life, I thought that social entrepreneurship might be a path for me. So the small test that I did was talking to every social entrepreneur that I could find, and also going to some social entrepreneurship hackathons to see if I had what it took to do this type of work. And that test was a solid confirmation for me that this is something that made me come alive, this was something that I felt that I could be good at, and that's very much what led to me being a social entrepreneur today. And then finally, that Kickstarter for homes, that website that we had hacked together, it did not take a lot of money or a lot of time to put together. But that experiment, that test, and the funds that we raised through it told my co-founders and I that this was something worth investing more time and energy into. And we built New Story. Now, enough talking about me. I want to go toward an example that many of you are probably familiar with. Some people in this audience are maybe even applying to Teach for America. I talked to a student here last night who was, so good luck to her. Teach for America has become a behemoth of an organization. They have over 50,000 alumni who have gone through the program. These alumni are now leaders in law and in politics and in medicine and in a number of other industries. One of their alumni is also the founder of a housing nonprofit. I did the 2011 core in Washington, D.C. What I found out recently is that in 2016, they raised close to $300 million in contributions for just that operating year alone. So they're massive. And more importantly, they're actually having an impact both in classrooms and at policy level, systems level change. But if you look at their founding story, you'll see the two themes that we talked about earlier. Wendy Kopp was an undergraduate student when she had the idea for Teach for America. She became very passionate about education and more knowledgeable about the fact that there was a massive education gap in the United States. At that time, she didn't have a PhD in education. She didn't even have teaching experience. But she didn't allow that inexperience to get in the way of her creating an organization that would ultimately change hundreds of thousands of lives. She armed herself with mentors, her professors, and other professionals in order to work smart, but she got started. And the way that she got started was doing these small tests to tell her if she should keep going on to the next step. The first was writing a thesis paper, which served as a bit of a business plan for what Teach for America ultimately became. In that business plan, she estimated it would take about $2.5 million to do the first pilot of Teach for America. So she had to start fundraising. She did not have grant writing experience, but she did a small test to see if people would fund her idea, if it was viable. So she started writing some grant proposals, and she got overwhelming amounts of no's, but she got one yes, and that test told her that she should move on to the next step. So she had to see if people would actually get into the classroom. Would talented, recent graduates commit to going and teaching in schools in some of the worst school districts in the country? So she got 100 recruiters and put them on college campuses, and she ended up getting her first core of about 500 students to go into the classrooms and to test out the idea of Teach for America. Now, an important thing here is that a minimum viable test is not one thing. It's not a yes, no, I go forth, I build Teach for America, or no, I don't. There were multiple small tests along the way that helped shape what Teach for America ended up becoming. And I know that Wendy, and now more so her team, they're doing these minimum viable tests all the time, probably daily, to help point them in the right direction to where to grow the company now. So why did I choose today to focus on these two lessons? I could have talked to you about my theory of change, about why New Story and our particular approach is really valuable. And I do believe that access to basic needs like housing is incredibly crucial to ending poverty. But so is education. And so is job creation, and so is political reform. There's no silver bullet to ending poverty. But there is one thing that I feel absolutely sure of, absolutely certain, that will get us closer to a more prosperous future for everyone. And that one thing, I'm going to tell you after a bit of a cliffhanger. I'm going to go to a reflection by one of my favorite thought leaders, Dr. Howard Thurman, who was a mentor to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he said, don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive, because that is what the world needs. It's people who have come alive. That one thing that I'm very certain of is that change comes from people. It's going to take an army of impassioned people with creative solutions working together in order to alleviate poverty. So if you are passionate, if what makes you come alive is social change and poverty alleviation, which I think it might be because you're sitting in this audience, then I don't care which issue area you choose to tackle. I care that you get started. I care that you do not let a lack of experience lead to fear and a lack of action. I care that when you come across the challenges that you will undoubtedly face, that you are powered with a toolkit of small tests to help guide you along your journey. There's certainly enough talent in this room to make societal systems level impact. I'm absolutely sure of that. So if we pair our lack of experience with humility and with mentorship instead of fear and instead of inaction, and if we use these small tests along the way to power us to make the right decisions on our journey, then I feel incredibly confident of a more prosperous collective future. Thank you.
All right, cool. Thank you so much, Alexandria. If you want to take a seat, we can go into our Q&A session. So right now, we're just going to, if anyone has any questions in the audience, feel free to raise your hand or just shout them out now about, whatever you want to talk to her about.
While your mind is brewing on some questions, I'll also share that New Story is very actively hiring for entry-level roles as well as internships. So I had another slide that didn't come up, but newstorycharity.org/careers if you're interested in working on poverty alleviation through community building and through housing.
Yeah, in the back.
That's a good question. So he asked, a lot of progress has happened. What would I have told myself many years ago when New Story was getting started? That's a great one. Probably a few things. Number one, your personal relationships are going to definitely suffer. I think as an entrepreneur, as a social entrepreneur, it's really difficult to do this work that is very all-encompassing, that you're incredibly passionate about, and also do things like remember your best friend's birthday, right? So finding ways to make sure that you nurture relationships along the way is one that feels top of mind. Another thing is probably around government and politics. I think we've had a very bottom-up approach, which is one of the reasons why we've been successful, right? We work with local entrepreneurs and local organizations, and we successfully build communities. But in order to have systemic change, things like making sure that There is land reform in particular countries so that people can feel confident about the fact that they own the land that their home sits on. That comes very much from the top down. So we are starting now at year 3 to build some of those government relationships in order to have a dual prong approach. And I probably would have told myself to attack the issue from both angles at the beginning.
Right.
How do you choose the family or the location?
Yeah, so he asked, how do you choose the family and how do you choose the location? So going back to my 15-year-old reflection, right, I was very passionate about and continue to be passionate about empowering and then working with local organizations. So where we go is actually very much based on the local partners that we find. So I'm constantly getting inbound information. I'm constantly doing research on what organizations are doing great work in community building and in housing. And then when one of those partners rises to the top, that will be the primary motivation for us to go and enter into a new country, is do we have the local organizational support there in order to do that work. And then we also rely on those local partners to decide how we do family selection. So in Haiti, for example, if we didn't do a lottery, there would be protests about our process not being fair, and our local partner gave us that information. So we go into a tent community, and we will take numbers for every single family, and then it goes into a lottery, and that's how families are chosen. So when we went into our second community in El Salvador, I thought that we would go about it the same way, but we listened to our local partner, and we listened to the families. And when we suggested a lottery, we were talking to a woman, I remember, and a tree had just fallen onto her home, right? So like the level of severity was there. And when we suggested a lottery to her, she said, no, come with me. And we walked up a hill. She said, this family is in deeper need because they had a lot of children and they had a few disabled family members. So a level of hierarchy of need was prevalent there, and so we went with a different approach. So each country has a different approach based on the community, the culture, and the advice that we get from our local partners.
Right here.
Could you share a couple of your pivot points where you were going in one direction and it proved to not be a good choice and you switched?
She said highlight a few of our pivot points where we were going in a direction and then we decided that we should switch. I won't go linearly, I'll just go with ones that pop up in my mind. One was we met a very wealthy individual who wanted to support News Story, but he had a Brazilian background, and he wanted us to work in Brazil. And this has happened in a few other countries as well. And so as a very early organization strapped for cash, we said, amazing, this guy is gonna give us millions of dollars to go to Brazil. And so we start doing a bunch of research and looking into going into that country, which didn't align. So once we started kind of doing that research, we realized that we shouldn't be going to a place based on the money being there. If that was the case, we would have mission drift and we would just be bouncing around without strategy. Instead, we needed to really go back to our roots and focus on making decisions based on the need and primarily based on the local partnerships that we found and that we cultivated. So we decided actually to turn away a lot of money and not pursue that Brazil option because that partnership piece wasn't there. So that was one pivot. Let's think of another one. Let's go to the next question, and I'm going to think of another one, and I'll definitely give you another one before we finish.
Right here. You. And yeah.
Okay, how did you make the
sorry.
first? Oh,
It's okay, go ahead. We'll come
okay,
back to
sorry.
it.
How did you
Sorry.
make the first key partnerships with your, like, the companies in the countries that you are going to, and then how did you continue to sustain those relationships?
Yeah, so the first one was actually fairly easy. One of my co-founders had gone and volunteered in Haiti about a year or two before we started the organization. And he had an incredible experience with a local organization there called Mission of Hope. And then upon doing further research into Mission of Hope's approach, we realized that that was, a partnership that we wanted to pursue. So that one was fairly easy. Then we actually found one of our strategies was to find organizations that were working in multiple countries, because then you could develop one strong relationship, and then you could potentially use and leverage that in order to go into multiple countries. So that's one of the ways that we try to sustain and not be managing too many relationships. So we have a partner called the Fuller Center, and with them, we're in El Salvador and in Bolivia, and we might be in Nigeria, fairly soon with that same partner. And the way that we sustain those relationships is in a number of ways, but I think the main one is by truly being partners. We do not have a top-down, outside-in approach. Every decision that we make it with our local partners. That requires a lot of phone calls, a lot of WhatsApp, visiting, et cetera, and just a lot of relationship building. I really do think that what I say to my partners all the time is this feels very familial. Right, with our project managers, I know, when they have grandchildren being born, I know the weddings that are happening in their family. Developing those relationships really allows us to have meaningful partnerships, allows us to have the transparency and the level of communication we need, because I'm based in San Francisco, and allows us to execute effectively. Another example of a time that I pivoted was with hiring. So I have my co-founders. The first hire that we made was right after we had finished Y Combinator, and we were getting a lot of press opportunities and a lot of speaking and just other really large opportunities, and we felt that we didn't have the bandwidth to take full advantage of the things that were being presented to us. So our first hire was a marketing one. And after a few months, we realized that marketing and spreading the word was not as important as making sure that the work was being done correctly. And so we made a change. We didn't necessarily have the budget to hire someone else. So we actually had to let that person go, and we hired someone to collect impact data. That ended up being kind of the first real hire on our team, because we wanted to make sure that we were working responsibly, that we were continually iterating our homes and our process, and making sure that every community we built was better than the previous one, and that if we weren't doing things right, because again, we were young, we didn't have a lot of experience, of course we're going to make some mistakes along the way, but we needed to make sure that we had the mechanisms in place to know when we were not doing things correctly and to pivot accordingly. So we went from kind of a marketing, branding, spread the word about news story, grow our online presence, et cetera, approach to let's get really smart about this, and then we'll actually have something more worth talking about later.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much for your time. I appreciate it.